All right. Yeah,
Awesome,
I think we're good to go.
Perfect.
Okay, I show 2:01 p.m. Looks like we got people that are still kind of filing in here. So we may give it just like maybe one more minute and we'll go ahead and kick this thing off. All right, I'm impatient and I hate awkward silences, so I'm going to go ahead and kick this thing off. Um, Thanks everybody for joining us today on this Powering Iowa webinar hosted by Professional Developers of Iowa. This is the third and final installment of the Powering Iowa webinar series. And yeah, today we're going to get a little bit more vocational where the rubber hits the road with RFI responses and kind of take a deep dive on that subject. And you know, here today, I'm joined by some experts in the field, some of which, if you watched last week's webinar, we've got some returning superstars as well as some new folks here as well. So I'm going to kick things off here with some with introductions of the panelists, and then take care of some housekeeping items here, and then we'll just dive into the content. But first, I just want to introduce Professional Developers of Iowa. I'm sure if you're on this webinar, you have a pretty good idea who PDI is. I've been a member for a long time, and this is the Professional Association for Economic Development here in Iowa. So it's been great to work with PDI and their staff, and some of the board members of PDI to not only put this concept together, but put together 3 good webinars focused on the utility world, the electric and gas world. So, and our panelists today, kind of going down the list here, I'll let them introduce themselves one by one, and then we'll take care of some housekeeping, starting with Bruce.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Bruce Hanson, Iowa Area Development Group. I work with business development across the state, existing companies, new projects. Iowa Area Development Group represents and works with the rural electric cooperatives, municipal electric systems that receive their power from the RECs, and also the independent telecommunication companies and that partnership with Arion.
Great, Paula.
Good afternoon, Paula Hazelwood. I'm the CEO for Advanced Southwest Iowa Corporation. Me and my staff, we cover all of the economic development for the city of Council Bluffs and all of the communities in Pottawatomie County.
Okay, Emily.
Great. Good afternoon, Emily Kaiser. I am a senior key account manager with Alliant Energy. So I serve our large commercial and industrial customers and economic development projects here in the Cedar Rapids area.
Thank you. And my name is Sam Wagner. I am Business and Community Development Manager for Mid-American Energy. I'm officed and live in beautiful Sioux City, Iowa, and I cover all of our larger industrial, commercial, and data center projects in the western portion of Iowa, as well as projects in southeast South Dakota, and even just a little bit in Nebraska as well. So thanks everybody for being on here today. So like I said, we're going to take a deeper dive into RFI responses, and really what we're wanting to do here is have an in-depth discussion about how utilities contribute to project RFIs, what our processes are for evaluating new projects, and exploring why it's so important to ask the right questions early on in the RFI process to help improve your competitiveness with your own responses. And so, our goal here is for you to walk away better informed about how you can proactively work with your utility partners to improve your RFI, the quality of your RFI responses, increase the ultimate competitiveness of your communities, and also help you understand how you can better understand the strengths and weaknesses of your own sites and understand their capabilities and sometimes limitations. So this would be a kind of a open sort of panel discussion. We like things conversational. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as the panel goes on. But also feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt us. Everybody knows I need to be interrupted often. So we'll take questions as they come as well. So. But let's go ahead and get started here. Usually, the first time that the dust utilities that we see electric and gas requirements for any given project is in that RFI when it's issued by the prospect or the site selector, IEDA. And most of the time that information is incomplete or doesn't make sense. And that sets into motion a process that we have to go through to gain some adequate load information so that we can be helpful to you and as well as the prospect companies. So Bruce, can you kick us off here and maybe talk about some of the minimum requirements that you look at to evaluate new electric projects?
Sure. When and all of us have seen bad RFIs. You'll get a one pager and you're trying to decipher what that is, and very broad numbers, broad information on the company and even what they do, and try to peel back the onion a little bit. And when you're talking with your companies or your clients, it's the old adage: help me help you be successful. The more information you can gather, the better you can relay that back to your utility partners. And there's no dumb question, and you always have to remember that you're the go-between. The economic developer is the go-between from the company and prospect to the utility, to the city, to the county, whatever that might be. And I think just explaining and building that relationship with them by asking questions, and again, if it's ambiguous information on the electric side, and I don't deal with on the gas side, but from an electric perspective, if it's ambiguous info, start with the basics of building size, hours of operation, types of equipment, types of operation, what kind of operation is it, and then taking the basic of that information back to the utility to talk through, here's what I have, might give them an indication on load factor, might give them an indication on, power usage if they have a similar type customer already or something like that. But if the info is very vague, just build that relationship and just say, hey, I'm trying to help you make this project happen and move forward with the utility.
And I could follow up a little bit with on the gas side. I mean, there's some very basic things that we look for on gas projects, typically it's how much gas do you need, right? And how we look at that is what is the peak usage, all right? So if you have everything going full gas, how much gas does the project require? And we also need to look at what the usage is, what the nominal usage is. And then the last thing we typically require is pressure, the delivered pressure. How much of that pressure they actually need forced into their boilers or their machinery. There's a lot of other things that we can ask for, but those very basic things are specifically, really what we, the very bare minimum that we would need to perform a system analysis, and we can talk about that in a little bit. And just to follow up with with what Bruce said, typically we need to. It's kind of similar on the electric side. We need to know what the peak usage is, and we talked a little bit last week about peak usage and peak demand as measured by kilowatts or megawatts, and usage as it's measured in kilowatt hours. How much electricity they're actually using, and so on and so forth. What I've got displayed up here is actually some utility information that was provided to us in a real live project RFI from a couple of years ago. And when I look at this, when I'm wearing my electric hat and I'm looking at this is great. As well as the natural gas side, this is great. This makes sense because we can. It's telling us they need 115 megawatts of peak demand. Their connected load, how much they're, how big of wires we need to build, to get their peak power to them, 135 megawatts. And when we kind of go through some of the calculations that that we go through, all of these numbers match up. I can usually figure out what the usage is if I know what their peak demand is and their load factor hours of operation. And without getting too deep into the weeds on this, from those of us in the utility world, we can look at this and go, hey, we can actually perform a system study based on this information. So this is a great example of a good project RFI. And honestly, I wish they were all like that. So I don't know if the panelists have anything they want to add to this, because I got a bad one too, and I'll show you here in a second.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add to this, and what makes this a really great RFI, is the timing. They provided obviously the ramp up schedule that is highly critical to utilities, just because we may have to build some of this capacity, but the way that they've laid it out here really gives us a good timeline on how quickly they need that. And again, it really helps us identify if we're able to deliver within their given timeframes as well.
Yeah. And so now that we got the good, let's take a look at what the bad is. This is from an actual project RFI, not from Iowa. So we're not going to shame anybody here, but this is a good example of just how we I would say this is not only just bad. This is actually kind of typical. We see this type of thing a lot. We need 6.3 million kilowatt hours per year. Well, that tells us nothing about what their peak demand is. It doesn't tell us what their hours of operation are, what any of the things they're doing. And on the gas, yeah, we have a good, we have some idea of what the volume of gas they're going to need, but it doesn't tell us nearly enough for us to even perform a system analysis. And so this is a good example of, as good as the other one was, this one is, this is one where we're going to have to come back to the prospect. We're going to have to come back to you as the economic developers and go, we got to get some more info here.
Sam, I would just mention the operations people, the engineers, and the operations folks of any utility are really going to be the check mark list, and they're going to ask pointed questions, require pointed questions, exact answers for their system, for their substation, how big of a transformer they need, and all of that, connected load, and those are the conversations you want to have apart from the prospect visit, and so you don't get into a back and forth and any misunderstandings. And so the better information you can get to the utilities and their operations and engineering folks, the better the process will be.
Yeah. And I think each one of us have a questionnaire or a load sheet that we provide. I know my local partners probably get tired of me sending that to them because I'm always like, yeah, start with this. But that's, we're not going to get any of this information unless we ask, and that's where some of these the load questionnaires, both on the electric and gas side, are a good starting point. Okay, Paula, now that you've heard us utilities moan and complain for the last several minutes, From your role, in your role and your perspective as a local economic developer, you deal with all sides of a project RFI from the very beginning all the way up through construction. Can you talk about why it's sometimes difficult to obtain adequate load information early on in a project?
I can. I actually wish we could take that good piece that you just showed in the PowerPoint slide and contribute or submit that to all of the site selection consultants across the world because that would save us a lot of time. But I think initially early on in the RFI, RFP process, they don't know what they don't know. They are, especially if it's a new build, they are probably, obviously relying on information from their engineering team. They may not have checked out all of the specs for the production or equipment that will be utilized on site. But I mean, this is a prime example. Sam and I worked on a project last year together. And this was a company, new to market company that was coming in looking at a site in Council Bluffs. They still are. But they came in with a really, really high electric number, megawatt number. And Sam and I kept talking about it and thinking, man, this is a lot of megawatt usage for what they're going to be doing at this campus. And so ultimately what happened is Sam was able to get his engineers and Mid-American involved in it, and they really took a much deeper dive into the reality of what they were going to be doing on this campus, the equipment that they were going to be using, and kind of where the power was going to be coming from geographically. And sure enough, it was about a third of what they initially told us that they need. So, I would say the earlier you get the information and ask the right questions. Another component of it, I really think, is confidentiality. Sometimes the end user, they may know a little bit more information. They don't directly share that with site selectors. They don't directly share that with the state, with IEDA. And then we're getting, kind of that pass on information. So I just think the earlier that, you can engage with your infrastructure, your power team and your natural gas teams to figure these things out, the more time you're going to save. Because Sam, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it took us a long time to process through all of that information before we finally realized that, okay, yeah, we actually were kind of guessing right at the start of the RFP process.
Yeah, that did take a while, and it was a bit of back and forth. And sometimes I think belies another issue, and that is that when we see these project RFIs, and this is a real challenge, right? And it's something that it's part of the reality of what we do. They don't always know the answers to the questions that we're asking them, right? Because they haven't designed the building yet, right? They haven't got all their motor lists all mapped out and everything sort of nailed down to the brass tacks. They don't necessarily know this stuff yet. So this really kind of kicks off this iterative process. But the earlier we can kick that off and ask the right questions, as we did with this particular example, Paula, I think it helped them dial in what the scope of their own project was.
Right. I would definitely agree with that. And just, as the confidentiality factor that I mentioned, I think too, all of you probably on this call have been exposed to non-disclosure agreements. And my organization, I mean, pretty much all the projects that we work on, we're under an NDA. And so sometimes agreeing to, consider and or sign that does help in getting some additional information early on, or at least along the way, as you're trying to gap and figure out some of these really important, vital parts of the project.
All right. Okay, so moving on. This next question is for Bruce and Emily. But Paul, if you feel strongly about this, feel free to chime in. Can you maybe just take a moment? Okay, we get all this information, and sometimes that's a painful process. Sometimes we get it up front, but so eventually we get enough that we can actually start to go to work. So can you briefly, and every utility kind of does it a little bit different. So Bruce, maybe starting with you, can you describe your process that that you and your partners with the RECs and such go through in evaluating new electric loads, and kind of talk about the different teams that you work with both within and outside of your organizations to kick this off?
Sure. Well, from a lot of our sites, industrial parks and locations around the state, if we're doing a multi-site search, it comes down to capacity of that industrial park, of that site. And I would just mention to every economic developer, and especially if you're new to the field, I would strongly suggest just to understand what your limitations are and capacities are for water, sewer, electric, and natural gas, because otherwise you may find yourself spinning wheels when you have a large load, either electric or gas, water, or sewer, that is going to be an insurmountable cost that you may end up wasting a bunch of time. And I think the best process, or usually what we end up doing, is once we qualify the client and start going through best sites, they narrow down to what part of the state. That's when the conversation begins about capacities, about connected load, and it does quickly get to the engineering folks and the operations folks to understand what this project is. So, and again, as I mentioned earlier, we're a conduit. All of us are. We're a conduit to those operations and to those utilities to help our utilities, but help our clients be successful.
Yeah,
Emily, how do you do it at Alliant?
Yeah, great. So, a lot of times the sites that are being submitted, we're really hopeful that we already know the sites that our communities are going to submit in any RFP because of the relationships that we have with the communities as well. The economic development organization typically provides us with the site in which they're submitting. So if they're submitting 1, 2, 3, however many sites within our service area that they're submitting, they provide us those locations. And then we take a look at those locations and identify substations, for example. Where will this customer be served from at this location? And what's the capacity of that substation? Do we have to make upgrades? And if we have to make upgrades, what is the anticipated revenue? So we go through a lot of different aspects of, what's their load. So again, critical that we know the load. So the KW, or the amount of megawatts, as well as the location. Those are two really, really important things. Again, some of those other really nice to have items are, what's the power factor? It's really also critical that we understand either KWH or load factor as we continue to consider what this does to our system. I would just also note Paula's comment about, further asking questions once we have that opportunity to do so, to identify the actual load. So at this point in time, there is a race for power. So we see a lot of site selectors increase that number in which they're looking for, because power is a long lead time item. And so they really increase that to make sure that they can capture any available power within that region. So again, the further and the faster that we can identify that actual need helps us really put less pressure on both our internal and external resources. Because again, if we don't own the transition, Alliant Energy doesn't own the transmission system, ITC does for our customers. So again, it allows us to lean a little less if ITC has to build or design a substation, those types of things. So that's just a little bit about how we work internally, and then additionally with our external partner as well.
Yeah, and with Mid-American, we have a process that we try to stick to, and it always seems like as much as we try to stick to that process, especially with larger, more complicated projects, the intent is there. But we eventually get to where we need to go. And, when we get that information, especially if it's a larger project, in the megawatts of power industrial projects, we have a whole system planning team that kind of maps out basically it gets it started. Yeah, okay, what needs to be done to serve it? Do we need to build a substation, or do we need to make improvements to a substation? Do we need to extend transmission lines? Do we need to bring in new feeder circuits, distribution feeders, whatever the case may be? We have a team, and what me and my colleagues at Mid-American, we kind of serve as a bit of a quarterback in that process. And invariably, if anybody's worked with engineers, they're never satisfied. They always have more questions, and I don't know the answer to those questions. And I think this is an important point that I want to make. We're not expecting the PDI members and our local partners here to know that either. You don't need to know what power factor is. But what somebody mentioned earlier, we're conduits, right? Like any good economic developer, you're typically not an expert in one thing, but you know a lot of different things. And if you don't, you know the guy that does, the person that does. And this is a great example of that, where they're going to come at us with questions that even I don't understand. But I know that if a prospect has got a design team and they have an electric engineer, they're going to understand what it is that we're asking, and then we can start to get some of that information. So with our process, we start with our system planning team and start to build out an entire plan to serve, and everything gets roped into that. What we need to build, what rates we're going to charge, what the costs are going to be, what the time frame is going to be, and eventually we get to a point where we can present that to the end use, to the end user, and that's a process that can take a little bit of time. For larger projects, that can actually be a little bit more complicated, take a little extra time. And for smaller projects like commercial projects or housing subdivisions, oftentimes we can handle that at the local level when they're not quite as complicated. So on the gas side, it's kind of a similar thing. In Mid-American, what we do is we have a whole process. We take the gas load information, we put it into this project portal that then goes to all the various teams that need to weigh in on what it's going to take to serve a given gas load. And what comes out of that is a very clear picture of what it's going to take. And then what I do is I'll prepare that into a document and send that out to the prospect and the local economic development partners and say, we got to run this amount of pipe, or we got to set that meter, or we got to build that TBS, or whatever the case may be. The details aren't important here. What is important is that each one of us, in our own way, we have a process. And my recommendation to the audience here is, if you don't already have a good relationship with the economic development folks, with your utility, develop that relationship and at least understand the process that we are engaged in to get basically this information back to your prospects.
So Sam, can I just add on to that real quick? So when we do an RFI or an RFP, I mean, our electric provider is obviously Mid-American Energy, and our gas provider is Black Hills Energy. And so when we submit our response back, the Mid-American team and Black Hills team will provide us a letter. They answer the questions that we've gotten as well as they can based on the information provided. But it really, when they respond back with this letter and the form that shows exactly what they need to provide to be able to generate additional information as the load goes, really sets the stage, I think, for future discussions with those prospects. And it also provides a really nice introduction to our utility partners, to not only the site selection folks, but also then the end user as well. So we get a lot of positive responses back from those pieces that are submitted on behalf of Mid-Am and Black Hills.
Okay. Emily, you work with, in your role as a key account manager, you work with both prospective new customers and existing customers that may be expanding. So what kind of information, and we go through this process, we kind of understand this, the focus, up until now, we've really kind of been focused on what can those prospects, what can those prospective customers bring to us so that we can do our work and be useful. And so what I want to talk about here is and maybe Emily, you can kind of speak to this. What information can utilities realistically provide to prospects when we start to get this information? What can we realistically provide to prospects at really at the very early stages of the RFI response? You know, whether we have adequate load information or not, and how we might approach that.
Yeah. So again, we are all, kind of used to some of those bad examples, or that typical example that you shared. So what that forces us to do is it forces us, in order to answer the questions, because again, RFIs are really an opportunity for us to stay in the game for this project. So when we have, less than full information, it really forces us to make some assumptions. So maybe we have to assume load factor, maybe we have to assume power factor. All of those types of things are some assumptions that we will create in order to provide the information that they're requesting. We certainly note those assumptions that we've made, just so they are aware of that those assumptions do exist and what they were. But those assumptions allow us to create that schedule, or understanding of, yes, we have capacity. So a lot of the times they also ask, can you serve this project? From Alliant Energy, we're always going to say yes. Yes, we can serve the project. And there's always that little caveat of, we can do anything with time and money, right? So we can do anything if we have the right amount of time, and the customer understands the cost to do so. So again, we will make assumptions that we have the time, those types of things as well, if that schedule is not provided. So again, we create some of those assumptions to create that cost of build out, to create that time aspect of it as well. We also use those assumptions if they're requesting a rate. So not all RFPs do, but some do request what their rate is going to be, a cost per kWh. Without full information, we have to make a number of assumptions to create that rate for them. And so again, that's just one that we know that, again, we want to stay competitive, so we will create advantageous assumptions throughout that process as well, just noting those assumptions. As Paula mentioned, utilities will provide that letter. So that letter really gives us the opportunity to talk about our programs in which we offer. So whether that be our renewable energy percentage, whether that be our energy efficiency programs, interruptible rate to, potentially lower the cost per kWh. That letter gives us a really, really, really great opportunity to share all of those things that the RFP may not have asked, but may set us apart from a competitive advantage perspective. I would just also note, thinking about timing and response time, it takes Alliant Energy some time to answer some of these questions, especially if it's a property that we don't respond to on a frequent basis. So as soon as you receive that, it is really important that you get that electrical information off to your utility, because it could take some time for us to be able to respond to that request, especially when we know that site selectors are already looking for a really quick turnaround. So in short, again, we really look to answer every single question on that RFP, even if that means that we have to create a number of assumptions while doing so.
I'll add just a few other notes. Very important, as Emily had mentioned, about the green power mix and resources and where that's coming from. More and more, we're seeing those conversations, how important it is that they can stamp their product with renewable energy usage or whatever that might be, wind, solar, hydro, even in some cases. And so I think that's always important. Oftentimes, and not a lot of times, but I've had requests on outage records that the utility is, for that particular substation, that particular site or whatever else, you may be aware of that, what kind of outage, and usually, it's in the high 90s of reliability, obviously. Some can say 99.9%, whatever, but that can be a question and an issue. Rate incentives, Emily had mentioned that can be a big one, depending upon the size of the load and that type of thing. And the only other thing I would add is I've seen the question of aid to construction of service. Is that on the utility side or is that on the customer side? And so that becomes a point to evaluate as well. So
Yeah, look, we made this point during the webinar last week. What is it that site selectors are oftentimes looking for? They're looking for, what's it going to take to serve my project? What's it going to cost my client? And how long is it going to take to do it? Right. Those are three basic. And then there's the fourth one, and Bruce kind of alluded to this. And I think a fourth question is now just equally as important as the other ones, and that is, how green is my power, and where's it coming from? And so this, we try to turn some of this information around to to really focus in on those real those sort of critical questions, especially in a multi-state RFI where we're not in site selection mode, we're in site elimination mode. And so you really are trying to drill down to that, even if you don't have every last cost captured or every last piece of information accounted for. Really what we are trying to do as your utility partners is try to answer those now four basic questions as early in the process as we can. But the only thing I would add to this is that with larger projects, it's almost like the larger the project, the longer it takes sometimes to even get to this basic point, to be able to answer those four questions. Right, because larger projects can oftentimes just be more complicated to figure out given the nature of the load and also its location, where the site is actually located. So that's where we kind of come in and try to get in early to understand it as early as possible so that we can turn around actionable information relatively quickly. But it is with projects getting the load size is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Even not just with data centers. I mean, just even just industrial projects that are getting bigger and bigger. Being able to turn some of this around sometimes does take a little bit longer than it used to, and that's just the nature of the beast. So, look, some projects involve just running a bit of wire, maybe setting a meter, easy peasy. I love those projects. While others may require some more intensive solutions, substations, transmission, whatever the case may be, and that can take a bit of time. So I'm going to pass this around to the panel members here. But what are you seeing for the timeframes involved in electric extensions to various types of projects, and what are some of the driving factors some of the factors driving the lead times for some more of these more extensive projects? Yeah, I'll start with Bruce. I'm gonna pass this around. Let's start with Bruce, maybe talking about commercial industrial projects.
I think the time frame probably a bit better than what it was during, supply chain issues and all of that. But and I'm not in operations, but we're working on a project now where it requires a new substation, and I think it was 18 months to 2 years for a sub. Upgrade to transmission lines are about the same. It depends upon location and where it's at. But we've also, typically a 3-phase line is not a tough thing to, an extension of that. But I think the supply chain piece may have improved a little bit, but it's still a little tough, from a timing standpoint.
Yeah, I would just add a little bit to that, and then even thinking about some smaller projects as well. So I agree. I think supply chain has gotten a little better. There are still a lot of pieces that we're seeing as a really long lead time. So, you know, smaller projects. So again, even if there's no sub upgrades, a small facility or a manufacturing facility or even a housing development, they're going to need transformers. So they're going to need transformers outside of a substation. So we're seeing okay lead time for some of those smaller units. As you get to those larger units, that's where we really see that time frame increasing. So again, small housing subdivisions, multifamily, you know, mixed use, those types of facilities, we're pretty okay. We can really traditionally meet with some of those build out timelines. And just really where we get into some of those larger projects, more unique equipment, those types of things that we do see some of those longer lead time items being required.
Yeah. Basically, the larger the transformer, the longer it takes sometimes. We're seeing the same thing. Our largest distribution transformers are 2,500 kVA transformer, and we've been able to stay ahead of the curve, thankfully. But whereas maybe before COVID and the supply chain pressures really started to bear down on us. I wasn't thinking about availability quite as much or planning for that quite as much. But we are today. Again, thankfully, we've been able to stay ahead of the curve, but it's something that some of the stuff we're watching. And the higher you get up the food chain with projects, with data centers in particular. Some of us in our markets have data center projects. They're just challenging from top to bottom because the equipment that they require on the utility side is always the biggest. It's the most intensive, and it always has the longest lead time items. And so for these these large projects, and I would even go another step and say for large scale industrial as well. Because we talked a little bit last week about the trend towards electrification that's transforming certain industries, and we're seeing some of that in I know some of the projects that I'm working on in the RFIs I'm seeing. It's resulted in projects that maybe didn't use as many megawatts a few years ago. They're using all the megawatts today. So so they're that's when you start dealing with substations. If it's a project that's going to be more than 10, 15 megawatts or above, we're probably going to need to build a substation. And the long lead time items on a substation are pretty much across the board: transformers, switchgear, circuit breakers, switchgear electronics. Right, it's just pretty much everything. And while from our perspective, we've seen some of the lead times start to level. They've leveled out and they've been pretty level for most of the last, I'd say 18 months, about 18 months or so. We haven't seen them for these big ticket items that very large industrial and data centers would require. We're not seeing those necessarily come down all that much, and there's a number of reasons for that across the board. So if I got to build a substation for a data center, I got to tell them it's going to be about 3 years. And that's from the time that we have a signed contract. We call it a facilities construction agreement. Some might call it a purchase power agreement, whatever the case may be. From the time that we have that contract in place and everything set up to when permanent power is available from that new substation, it's typically going to take about 3 years. So large scale projects, yeah, they take a while. They're a little bit more complicated, and we are still seeing some supply chain pressures on those larger projects. And
yeah, go ahead, Sam.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say one other, really changing dynamic in this space as well is historically utilities have been the only ones competing for these manufacturing slots for transformers. It is no longer just utilities procuring transformers. It is the large scale projects. We're seeing large scale projects work to really procure their own equipment for, say, customer owned substations or those types of things. Customers with large access to capital. We're hearing this all over the news. Customers with large access to capital have that ability to procure this equipment before they've even selected a location. So they have the equipment as they're continuing to construct the building. So we're looking at changing dynamics in that front as well. Just like many other industry clusters, the utility is not unique in this, but it is something that historically hasn't been a norm, but is more a norm now than what we've ever experienced in the past.
And I tell you, we talked to Emily and Bruce, and I know Paula has talked to developers that have done projects in other parts of the country. They're hearing this all over. This is not an Iowa thing. This is not a Midwest thing. And in fact, I think in a lot of ways we might have a little bit better here than some other areas of the country. And so when I tell a prospect that it's going to take 3 years to build a substation, they're kind of like, okay. Yeah, because, PG&E's telling me it's going to be 5, right? Or, Duke is going to be something else, or whatever the case may be if they're looking at other markets. And so I think that's important to note, that even though we're going to be quoting some extended lead times, especially compared to pre-pandemic, it's not, we're not an outlier. And this is a national issue, and I know I see it. All right, so Paula, back to you. At what point in a project or RFI response is it more advantageous for utilities to begin working directly with a prospect? Oftentimes, we're working through you, or we're working through IEDA. Eventually, we got to start talking to the end use customer. So, from your perspective as a local economic developer, when does it make the most sense for the utilities to start talking directly to the end user?
Well, aside from, we talked about earlier, the warm introduction, read the RFI process. Typically for us, when that happens is when the project, when they funnel the sites down and we enter the shortlist phase. And so when we are shortlisted, we are notified that we will be having an in-city visit. That is typically when we engage not only our natural gas and electric provider, but all of our utility providers. So if the site selection consultant team and the end users are coming to town, we don't want to be really mindful, of their time and make the most of the time that we have with them. So again, if you had not already explored the possibility of an NDA, I would suggest doing so again at this time, because it makes for a much better meeting when everybody in the room can be transparent. I think somebody on the call earlier said, the more information you can provide us up front, the better that we're able to help you on the back end. And that is always the case. In the experience, my 20 some years of experience, economic development, and specifically in city visits, have gotten, I would say, more casual, but more focused. And so where you build a much more relationship focused kind of environment with the group that you're working with, and our utilities play a vital role in that. So for us, it always starts with that. And I will tell you, Sam, we have a in-city visit template that we use. So we have an agenda and itinerary that we always have teed up. And we gauge what is most important to the client, because obviously that's what we're here for, to serve them. And then we customize that itinerary based on the information that they've told us. But our template is usually pretty spot on with the important components of the information, just depending on what the industry vertical is. So the earlier, the better. I can't say that enough. The earlier, the better that you get your infrastructure partners involved in the project, specifically when you are shortlisted and you're going to be getting an in-city visit, the better the project is going to be at the end, and the more competitive that you can be as well. So, yeah,
NDAs are a tool in that case. Especially if it's a competitive industry sector.
Right.
they don't want they don't necessarily want things getting out that they're, that they're building a facility or where they may be looking or whatever the case may be. There's a gazillion reasons why they want to keep it secret. We can't let, from my perspective as a utility guy, I cannot get caught up in that. And I will proactively offer up, look, we're trying to be as useful, to you as we can. And we're like, here's our NDA. Okay, let's just go with it. And you got secrets, we'll keep them. And here's the contract, and that ensures that. I'll enter into NDAs all day long if it helps us advance things more expeditiously.
We will as well. And I mean, we have a standard template of one of those as well. So
yeah, as do we.
Have to be prepared for everything, right?
Yeah. Okay, so we're kind of winding down here. We got about 10 minutes left. So I want to ask maybe kind of a couple of parting questions. So some of the stuff, I think we threw a lot out there today. I think we only scratched the surface. Paula, you and I and the other partners that I work with, that this only just scratched the surface. And so what I'd like is maybe just kind of kick this around to the group, maybe starting with Bruce and Emily. Take all of this, distill it down. Not everybody needs to be a utility expert, nor do we expect them to. But early on in these processes, when you're developing RFIs, or if you have an opportunity to be talking with a site selector or a prospect early on in the process, what fundamental questions do you think economic developers should be asking of their prospects to improve the quality of the load information that's provided to the utilities, and by extension, the quality of the information that's returned back to them? So on electric projects, hey, I'll kick this over to Bruce and Emily. What do you think the takeaway should be here for the local partners?
So I can maybe start. I think that really there are two of the most critical pieces are peak demand as well as, load factor. So again, those really help shape how we're going to be able to serve that load. So some of those other things, those can come, but those are the two things that we need in order to even begin assessing. Now, I would say some of the other really important pieces is timeline. So see, it's a 20 megawatt project and we only have 10 megawatts of capacity in a substation. We have to, expand the capacity within that sub. And so timing becomes critical to understand if we would be able to meet that expansion schedule. So again, those are the two most important. If we don't have timing, we'll assume that we have the time, right? But those are really the two most important things from our perspective that'll really allow us to begin researching. Now, again, if we had more time, we could certainly go into the nice to haves. But those are, like I said, just the two most critical things for our process.
I would point out, I think Jim Gossett put together a glossary of terms that will be housed with the videos and whatever. That's a great place to start for economic developers, just to learn and know more about the jargon and what is load factor and what is power factor and all of that. So I would start there for sure.
Yeah. Paula, what about from your perspective as a local economic developer?
So I know sometimes, if it's a new to market company looking to come in, or even an existing company that's looking to expand, and we're trying to drill down deeper into what their actual needs are, I've gone back to them and asked them, do you have another plant someplace else that you can provide some comparables from as at least a good starting point? And if they do not, then, go to your equipment manufacturers and try to get, some information, your engineers, but you know, I think a comparable scenario, which many of the companies we work with do have that option. And obviously it's probably not going to be the same power provider, same natural gas provider, but at least it would give some type of starting point if we could get a comparable. And we have been able to obtain some of that along the way with some projects that we've worked on, which has been helpful. So
Okay.
ask questions.
Right, right. All right, and on gas, like I want to know if they're using the gas as part of their process or it's just to heat their building. I need to know what their peak usage is, so I know how big a pipe to build. I need to know what pressure they need it delivered. Pretty much, I can go from there. And I may have some follow-up questions, but if I can get that, man, we're off and running, and we're getting useful real quick. All right, so we got about 5 minutes left. If there's any questions, drop it in the chat, or somebody wants to interrupt me, feel free. I'm just going to finish this up with a just kind of a general question to the panel here. And this is really kind of kicking it back to our PDI members. I mean, how can PDI members better understand the opportunities and limitations of their sites for electric and gas service? What can they do to better understand their sites?
I would do a field trip. Get in the truck with some operations folks and just start to know your capacities and capabilities of the site. And if you get to know your operations people, and again, we're all conduits to the engineering group and the operations folks, but they'll get right down to brass tacks on what they need from you, from your client. So I would do a field trip, get in the truck, get to learn the jargon of the utilities. I think a lot of that's helpful. So.
I think, you know, even ahead of that, knowing what you have and what your site is capable of, which was touched on early on in the conversation, is key. So the certification program that the state has is wonderful. But if you cannot do that, or if your site does not qualify for that, at least do a desk review and have the high level information. Know what the limitations are for the sites that you are, at least the sites that you're submitting on a regular basis. That'll save you time. It'll save the site selector time, and it'll save everybody along the way in the project time, because you already have some upfront important information, and it adds to your competitiveness and your timely kind of response factor. So I would say if you can do that, at least a desk review with your infrastructure partners on what your site is capable of or restrictions.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think the only other thing I would add is actually two things. It's just really important to make sure not only your electric and gas utilities, but all utilities to maintain and build a strong relationship. Because again, that's how you're going to get the best and quickest information. That's how this property is going to get in front of them. So Sam mentioned it earlier, if you don't have a relationship with your utility partner, go build one, because they are going to be highly critical in the expansion and attraction process. Another piece I would just note is it's also important to understand and share with your partner utilities what the desired vision is. So again, if your city has done some master planning or has a strategic area that they're really looking at, make sure your utility partners know that. Some of them are doing business attraction activities. You know, some of them really, if they find a opportunity, they want to make sure it's a good fit for your community too. So make sure you build the relationship in that aspect, that they also know what it is you want in your community as well.
And my parting thought on all of this is do this during the off season. Don't try to do this as a cautionary tale. Don't try to do this when you have a project bearing down. Right? You shouldn't be learning about your site. And this is everybody. Oh, I think we all know this, right? It just bears repeating, right? I don't think I'm saying anything we don't already know. We're all pros. But it is, I think it does bear repeating and emphasizing that you do this work during the off season. You build those relationships, and you do this type of work. You do it when when you don't have a project breathing down your neck, because that's no fun. So with that, I'm looking at the chat. I'm seeing that we did such an amazing job of covering everything that nobody has any questions whatsoever, because we answered all of them. No, there's still nothing in the chat. We must have done a hell of a job. All right, I show 3 o'clock. Thank you so much, Emily, Paula, Bruce. It's you guys are great partners. A wealth of expertise here. Feel free to reach out to any one of us. We're not hard to find. And if we can be of help to you with any of your work, please feel free to reach out to us. Even if you're not in my service territory, I'm happy to talk with you. And lastly, a note of thanks to the folks at PDI staff. They did a great job pulling this whole thing together, and I'm glad we were able to close the show. So with that, I'll bid us all adieu, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.